Welcome. My name is Leon Filbert. I'm the evangelist for the Church of Christ that meets at the corner of Canby number 2 and Buku Main Road. And I want to thank you for viewing Truth in Christ broadcast. This program was designed with you in mind to inform, edify, strengthen, and build you up in the word of the Lord. And so join me as we examine God's word today. The lesson is taken from 2 Peter chapter 3, verses 1 to 9. And I've chosen as a title, God, the Keeper of Promises. God, the Keeper of Promises. And there are 3 points that I would like to share with you in today's lesson. We're looking at, or we'll be examining, God's ability, God's credibility, and our response to the promises of God. Those are the 3 points that I would like to develop and share with you. And the aim is to encourage us, you the listening audience and myself, not to give up on the promises of God. I know that we have been in the past disappointed by the promises of man, and we will be disappointed in the future. But what we need to do is not to compare the promises of man with the promises of God. God is not a man. And so regardless of what we might have experienced, where man is concerned, I want us to never give up on the promises of God. Don't lose hope, don't lose faith, but keep on trusting in the promises of God. And so as we examine God's ability, because when someone makes a promise, the first thing that you want to be assured of is the ability of that person to keep that promise. You want to know that the person have the means. They have what it takes to carry out or to execute that promise. And so the Apostle Paul in the book of Ephesians chapter 3 and verse 20, he tells us, unto him that is able to do exceedingly abundantly above all that we ask or think, according to the power that works in us. Here he's talking about God's ability. God is able to do, first of all, he has the means, but he's able to do in a particular way. He's able to do exceedingly, abundantly. He's able to do above and beyond what we ask or what we can imagine to ask. This is the God that we're talking about. In the book of Luke chapter 1 and verse 37, Jesus said, with God, nothing will be impossible. With man, there is a limitation. There are some things man cannot do. They're limited. But when it comes to God, nothing is impossible. And we need to bear that in mind. The Hebrew writer tells us in chapter 11 and verse 1, he said, now faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. Faith in God is based on evidence. It's based on assurance. It's based on proof. Faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence or the proof, the assurance of things not seen. We want to keep that in mind as we look at God's ability. The Bible tells us in the book of Romans chapter 4 and verse 21, it's making reference to the promise that God made to Abraham. He says in verse 20, he did not waver at the promise of God through unbelief, but was strengthened in faith, giving glory to God, and being fully convinced that what he had promised, he was also able to perform. Abraham was fully convinced. And that's what we're talking about. The ability. God's ability. God, the keeper of promises. This is what we are looking at. And as we think about God's ability, we want to bear in mind his power and his might. God is omnipotent. He's all powerful. We want to bear in mind God is all knowing. He sees all, he knows all. And he's always present. He's ever present. In the book of Genesis chapter 1, I will just point you to or refer you to Genesis chapter 1. If you want to see the might of God, and you want to see the ability of God, you just need to go to chapter 1 of Genesis, read the whole thing, and you would see how powerful, how mighty God is. Because in the beginning, God said, "Let there be," and there was. So you need to keep that in mind. Paul said in 2 Timothy chapter 1 and verse 12 that he was persuaded that Jesus could have kept the promise that he had entrusted unto him. And that's what we need to keep in mind. But apart from God's ability, we need now to look at his credibility. It is one thing to make a promise and have the ability to fulfill that promise. It's another thing to actually fulfill it, to go through with it. I'm sure that you know persons who would have made promises and they had the means. They could have fulfilled their promise, but they did not. And so, the second thing we want to look at is God's credibility. The keeper of promises is credible. He's reliable. He's trustworthy. We can put our trust in him always, all the time. We first of all want to look at past promises kept. Did he keep? And has he kept promises made in the past? In 2 Peter, he referred to one of those promises. He said, scoffers and mockers would come saying, where is the promise of his coming? From since the inception of time, the creation, all things continued as they were. Nothing has changed. Some people will tell you that since I was a little boy, I heard Jesus coming up. They are now big men, man and woman, and they're saying, this thing can't be so. He coming soon, he coming, and I ain't seen him. But hear what Peter says. This they willfully ignore. They leave out something. And he points to that. He points to Noah and the flood. He said, by the word of the Lord, the then world was changed. And so I would direct you to Genesis chapter 6 through 8, where you will read of the account where God spoke to Noah. And he told Noah of his future plans. He said he was going to destroy mankind and everything that he have created, the animals. He's going to destroy mankind and all that liveth upon the earth. Because mankind had strayed from God, and every imagination of his thoughts were evil continually. And it repented God that he had made man. He said, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to bring a flood and purge or cleanse the earth with water. At that time, rain had not fallen from the sky. The Bible tells us water came up from the earth as a mist. And so, as God intended to cleanse the earth, he says, but Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. So Noah found someone that he could have used, he could have preserved, right, or used for the preservation of mankind. And that person was Noah and his family. So he told Noah what to do. Build an ark, a boat, a big boat that will float on water. Because water is going to rain upon the earth for 40 days and 40 nights. It's going to fill all the mountains on the earth. It's going to cover the mountains of the earth. And we find that in the ending up of chapter 8, Noah did what God said. And God fulfilled his promise. When the ark was finished, God shut the door. And the rain came tumbling down. And I'm sure that you would have heard about the Noah and the ark if you have not read the account yourself. And the God, the keeper of promises, is showing us where he fulfilled what he said he was going to do. In the book of Genesis, chapter 12, verses 1 to 3, chapter 15, 4 and 6, chapter 17, verse 1, 17 and 24, and chapter 21 and verse 5. I refer to all of these passages because we find in Genesis chapter 12, 1 to 4, what we refer to as the land, nation, and seed promise, where God promised Abraham that he was going to give him the land of Canaan, a land flowing with milk and honey. But not only was he going to give him the land, but he was going to make him a great nation. He was going to increase his seed or multiply his seed. And through his seed, all families of the earth will be blessed. All nations of the earth will be blessed. So it is from this passage we get the land, nation, and seed promise. And this is repeated in other places in Genesis, as I quoted a while ago. What we find here, what is strange about, or what is interesting about this promise is that when God made this promise to Abraham in chapter 12 and verse 4, the Bible tells us. So Abraham left as the Lord had told him, and Lot went with him. Abraham was 75 years old when he set out from Haran. When God first told him, he was an old man, that he was going to have an offspring. And so Sarah, his wife, had passed the age of childbearing. So this is not a promise to take lightly, because in Abraham's mind, I know that these things would come to bearing. You'd wonder, well, how come, or how can I have children with Sarah when she has passed the age of childbearing? In chapter 17 and verse 1, God repeated, or he confirmed, the promise to Abraham that he will bless him and he will have a son. At this time, he is now 90 years old. 15 years have passed. And what I want you to bear in mind is the fact that time to Abraham may seem to be running out. I'm getting older and older and older. But God said, you're going to have a son. When Sarah heard about God's promise, she laughed, because she said to herself, after I have passed the age of childbearing, would I be able to bless my husband with a child? She understood the science involved in what was promised. She understands that how things are, it doesn't seem possible for her to bring forth a child. But I want you to also look at Genesis chapter 21 and verse 5, because the Bible tells us that Abraham was 100 years old when he had his first son through his wife Sarah, Isaac. Now, of course, if you read the account carefully, you would find where Sarah came up with her own ideas and her own plan, and saying maybe God means it's through one of my servants that this blessing is going to come. That was not his plan. That was her idea. God said Abraham was going to have a son by his wife, and she's going to bring forth a child for him. And that came to pass according to the plan of God. Now, he said he was going to make him a great nation. He was going to increase his seed. And so Isaac begot Jacob. Jacob had Joseph, had Esau. Let me just back up here. God was going to fulfill his plan through Isaac. Abraham had Isaac. Isaac had Jacob and Esau. And Jacob had the 12 tribes of Israel. And I want to make the point, and I want you to know, that the rest of the Bible, the Old Testament, is about God's fulfilling the first two promises to Abraham. This is the nation promise and the land promise. This is God. God is showing us how he went about to fulfill that promise, beginning with the nation. We find in the book of Exodus, chapter 1, and you had to read the whole of chapter 1, because several places it is mentioned, where the Israelites became a great nation in Egypt. "75 of them went into Egypt, but over 500,000 came out of bondage." And I want you to see, all right, this is God fulfilling his plan to Abraham, that I will make thee a great nation. I want to tie into this because it so happened that the fulfillment of the great nation also brought about the fulfillment of the bondage promise. In Genesis chapter 15 and verse 13, God said, "Know assuredly that your descendants will go into captivity for 430 years. And we are talking about the keeper of promises. God, the keeper of promises, the one who is going to fulfill and who has fulfilled all promises made by him in the past. And so we find where they went into captivity in Exodus chapter 1. God fulfilling his promises. So the nation promise is fulfilled. We now need to go to the book of Joshua to read of the conquest of Canaan, where God is now fulfilling the promise that he made to Abraham, that I'm going to give unto thee the land of the Canaanite and the Hivite and the Jebusite, and all of that was fulfilled in the book of Joshua and Judges. Again, we see God's fulfilling his past promises. The seed promise, the third promise, is fulfilled in the New Testament. And I want you to understand that this promise had its inception in Genesis chapter 3 and verse 15, where God said, after Adam and Eve sinned, he said, I will put enmity between the seed of the woman and the seed of the serpent. And that seed promise goes all the way through chapter 12, what we just looked at, all the way through the New Testament, because the seed promise was not talking about seed as in many, but seed as in one. And Paul tells us in Galatians that seed was Christ. The seed was Christ. The blessing was the redemption from sin, the forgiveness of sins. Acts chapter 3, verse 26. You could read it a little earlier. But verse 26, it points out, in turning away every one of you from his iniquities. So the seed promise is fulfilled, and it's being fulfilled through Christ, through the forgiveness of sins. And that is the preaching of the gospel. So we looked at past promises, and we are looking at his credibility based on his track record. What he did in the past will give us an idea what he can or will do in the future. And so Jesus said, let not your heart be troubled. You believe in God, believe also in me. In my Father's house are many mansions. If it was not so, I would have told you. I go to prepare a place for you. And if I go, I will come and receive you unto myself. So the promise of receiving a heavenly mansion is made to us by Jesus. I believe it, and I'm looking forward to it. In Matthew chapter 11 and verse 29 and 30, Jesus said, he said, you're going to find rest unto your soul. The promises rest unto our soul. In 2 Thessalonians 4, 13 through 18, we have the promise of the resurrection. Jesus said, I am the resurrection and the life. This is in the book of John. So there are future promises. And I close today's lesson with what should our response be? Go back to 2 Peter chapter 3, verses 11 through 13. Peter said, seeing that all of these things are going to come to pass, what manner of persons ought you to be? Our response should be based upon our faith in Jesus. It should be based on our obedience to Jesus. And it's based upon our growth in Jesus. In other words, if we believe in his promises, real faith is demonstrated by obedience, doing what he says. James tells us about that. And real faith is supposed to activate a desire to grow, to know more, so we can do more. Beloved, don't give up on the promises of God. Until the next time, I bid you Godspeed.